There is a canyon in the Sierra Nevada foothills that almost nobody planned to make. It is nearly a mile and a half long. In places, it is close to 600 feet deep and as much as 3,000 feet wide. The walls are streaked orange and rust and pale gold, and when the late sun hits them, they look like something out of the painted desert in Arizona. But this is not Arizona. This is California, a few miles outside the little town of Nevada City. And here is the part that stops me cold every time I read the records. No river carved this canyon. No earthquake opened it. No glacier ground it out over 100,000 years. Men made it. Men made it in about 30 years on purpose with water. They aimed water at a mountain until the mountain was gone. I want you to sit with that for a second, because the modern mind reaches for an excavator. We picture yellow machines, diesel engines, a fleet of dump trucks the size of houses. None of that existed yet. There were no hydraulic excavators, no bulldozers, no dynamite shovels biting 40 tons at a swing. There was a wooden nozzle, a leather hose, a stream of water under enormous pressure, and a hunger for gold that did not know how to stop. They pointed that stream at whole hillsides and washed them into mud, and they ran the mud through wooden troughs and picked the gold out of the slurry. They tore the tops off mountains the way you would hose mud off a driveway. And they did it well enough, and at a scale large enough, that they changed the shape of the land, the color of the rivers, and eventually, the law of the country. This is the story of hydraulic mining, the strangest and most violent way Americans ever went looking for gold. It is a story about ingenuity that I genuinely admire, and about a price that took everyone, the miners included, a long time to understand. Let me tell it the way the records tell it. It begins, as so many of these things do, with men running out of easy gold. When the 49ers first poured into California, the gold was loose in the stream beds. You could crouch at the water with a pan and swirl the gravel and watch the heavy yellow flakes settle in the bottom. That was placer mining, and it was simple, and for a few years it was enough. But the loose gold gave out fast. The rivers had been worked over by thousands of hands. The men who stayed had to ask a harder question. Where did all that river gold come from in the first place? And the answer the geologists eventually worked out was that ancient rivers, rivers older than anyone could imagine, had once run through these hills and laid down gravel beds rich with gold, and then the land had risen and the rivers had moved, and those old gold-bearing gravels were now buried high up in the hillsides, locked in dirt and clay, hundreds of feet thick. The gold was up there. It was just trapped inside a mountain. Now, you could dig it out with a pick and a shovel and a wheelbarrow. Men tried. It was brutally slow. A whole crew might move a few cubic yards of gravel in a day, and most of that gravel was worthless, and the gold was spread so thin through it that you needed to move mountains of dirt to find any real money. So somebody, sometime in the early 1850s, looked at the problem and looked at the streams running down the canyons and had an idea that was either brilliant or insane, and honestly was a little of both. What if you did not dig the mountain? What if you washed it? The man most often credited with the first real attempt is Edward Madison, sometimes spelled Madison, working near Nevada City in 1853. The story, as it comes down to us, is wonderfully crude. Madison took water carried down from higher ground, ran it through a hose, and fitted the end of that hose with a nozzle he carved out of wood. The hose itself was rawhide, or canvas in some tellings, and he aimed that jet of water at the gravel bank in front of him and let the pressure do the digging. The water tore the dirt loose. The loose dirt and water ran off as a thick slurry, and the gold, being heavy, could be caught downstream. He had turned the stream into a tool. He had turned gravity and water into a machine with no moving parts. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button. Come back. Because the men who stood at the end of those hoses, most of them, we do not even know their names, and I want to keep telling their story. What I find remarkable about Madison's idea is how fast it grew, and how much engineering it demanded once people saw that it worked. Because a trickle of water will not wash down a mountain. To tear a hillside apart, you need water under tremendous pressure, and to get pressure you need height, and a lot of water falling from a great height through a closed pipe. So the whole problem became a problem of plumbing on a scale that is hard to picture. The water had to come from somewhere far away and far above, and it had to arrive at the nozzle still under enormous force. So they built the water systems first, before they could fire a single shot at a hill. And these water systems are, to me, the most quietly astonishing part of the entire story, more astonishing than the canyon itself. The miners and the companies built dams high in the mountains to catch the snowmelt and the rain. They built reservoirs to hold it, and then they built ditches and wooden flumes to carry it down, mile after mile after mile, hugging the contours of the ridges, crossing canyons on tall wooden trestles, threading through cuts in solid rock. At the great mine near Nevada City, the water traveled from the high reservoirs through a wooden canal, a flume, that ran in places up to 45 miles long. 45 miles of hand-built wooden channel, laid by men with axes and saws and mules and their own backs, just to deliver the water to the nozzle. Across the whole gold country, the total length of these ditches and flumes ran to thousands of miles. They built a private river system across the Sierra by hand to wash down the hills. And building those flumes was its own kind of dangerous, slow, exposed work. A flume is a wooden channel, and to keep the water moving at a steady, gentle grade across broken country, the builders had to carry it level across deep gullies and around steep canyon walls. So they raised it on trestles, tall, spindly frameworks of timber, some of them rising high above the canyon floor, carrying the wooden trough across open air. Men worked up on those frames, bolting and pegging the timber together, with nothing under them but the rocks far below. They cut the channel into cliff faces where they had to, hanging on the wall. And once it was built, it had to be tended forever, walked and patched and cleared of debris, because a single break in a high flume would spill the company's whole water supply down a hillside and shut the giants down. The flume tenders walked those miles in all weather. It was lonely, cold, dangerous work, and it never stopped, because the water never stopped. And the scale of the water they moved through it is almost beyond belief. At the largest operation, 11 principal reservoirs held the water, covering something like 11,000 acres of mountain storage, with a capacity measured in billions of cubic feet. At full operation, that one company was running through more than 100 million gallons of water in a single day. 100 million gallons a day in the 1870s, with no electric pumps, no diesel, nothing but gravity and the careful slope of a wooden channel doing all the work. They had read the mountain like a map and taught the water to come down exactly where they wanted it, at exactly the pressure they needed. Now the tools at the business end. Once the water arrived under pressure, it went into the nozzle, and the nozzle is the thing that gave hydraulic mining its terrible character. They called these nozzles monitors. They also called them giants and dictators. They were great iron tubes, some of them 8 or 9 inches across at the throat, mounted on a kind of swiveling base, a double gimbal, so that one man could swing the stream left and right and up and down. The most famous of them carried the name the Little Giant, which is a fine, grim joke when you understand what it did. Anthony Chabot is generally credited with developing the practical hydraulic nozzle in the mid-1850s, refining Madison's wooden experiment into a real iron instrument. And the power coming out of these monitors was not a garden hose. It was a weapon. An 8-inch monitor could throw something like 185,000 cubic feet of water in a single hour, and it threw that water at roughly 150 feet per second. Depending on the size, a monitor could expel anywhere from 5,000 to 11,000 gallons of water every minute. The stream could reach out more than 200 feet from the nozzle and still hit hard enough to move boulders. The records say a 50-pound rock could ride the crest of that jet like a cannonball. Let me be plain about what that means. That stream of water would kill a man. It did kill men. More than one worker died standing too close, or losing footing in the wrong place, or being caught when a bank gave way. A jet that can carry a 50-pound boulder will not pause for a human body. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. So picture the work itself, because this is where I really want you to stand in their boots. It is morning in the diggings. The flume has been carrying water down all night. A crew of men stands at the foot of a gravel cliff that might be 300 feet tall, a wall of old riverbed packed with clay and stone, and somewhere in it, the gold. They open the monitor. The jet comes out white and hard and so fast it looks solid, more like a glass rod than a stream of water, and it slams into the base of the cliff. And the mountain begins to come apart. The water cuts into the bank, undermines it, and great masses of gravel and clay slough off and collapse into a churning brown river at the men's feet. The noise must have been tremendous. The whole hillside dissolving into mud, the constant roar of the nozzle, the crack of rock, the slurry rushing away. They would aim the giants at the base of a hill and let the whole face fall, and then wash the rubble away and aim again, and the hill simply retreated. Day after day. The biggest mine, at its peak, ran 7 of these giant monitors around the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And at full stride, that single operation washed down and processed something on the order of 50,000 tons of gravel a day. But washing the mountain into mud is only half the trick. The other half is getting the gold back out of all that mud, and this is where the cleverness comes in. All that slurry, the water and gravel and clay and gold, had to be made to flow through long wooden channels called sluices. A sluice is a simple thing in principle. It is a wooden trough, sometimes built in sections that ran for hundreds of feet, set on a careful downhill slope. The bottom of the sluice is fitted with riffles, which are little crossbars or cleats, ridges set across the floor of the trough. As the muddy water rushes over them, the riffles make the flow tumble and slow in pockets, and the heavy material, the gold, settles down into those pockets and stays, while the lighter mud and gravel keep on washing through and out the end. Gravity does the sorting. Gold is far heavier than rock, so it sinks and lodges while everything else flees downstream. There is one more piece of the system that I have to describe, because it is the part that ate men quietly, away from the spectacle of the giants. The slurry coming off the diggings had to drain away from the pit, and as the pit grew deeper, that became its own enormous problem. So the North Bloomfield Company drove a drainage tunnel through solid bedrock, nearly 8,000 feet of it, almost 1.5 miles of tunnel cut by hand through stone to carry the water in the waste out the far side of the ridge and down toward the river. Think about that work. Men in the dark, with hand drills and black powder and candles, boring through rock for years, so that the giants up in the daylight could keep washing down the hill above their heads. The tunnel took years to finish, and only when it was done could the mine reach its full terrible pace. The work above ground was loud and dangerous. The work below ground was silent and dangerous, and it was just as much a part of the machine. The boulders that came down too big to wash through had to be hauled out of the sluices by hand, with iron forks, or lifted out with derricks if they were too large to handle. And here is the part of the recovery that we now know was the quiet poison in the whole enterprise. To catch the very finest gold, the flour gold, the dust too small to settle on its own, the miners laid mercury along the bottom of the sluices. Mercury and gold cling together. The fine gold would bind to the mercury and be held in the riffles, and later the miners would gather up the heavy silver-colored amalgam and drive the mercury off with heat to leave the gold behind. It worked. It also meant that an enormous amount of mercury was poured into these sluices, and a great deal of it washed away with the tailings and went downstream with everything else. That mercury is still in the rivers and the wetlands of the Central Valley today, more than a century later. They did not know what they were doing to the water, but they were doing it on a massive scale, and the gold was real. This was not a fever dream that paid nothing. By the middle 1880s, it is estimated that hydraulic mining had recovered something like 11 million ounces of gold from the California hills. 11 million ounces, worth, by much later valuations, billions of dollars. That is the number that kept the monitors roaring. That is why they built 45 miles of flume and 11,000 acres of reservoir and a fleet of iron giants. The gold was up in the mountains, and they had found a way to wash it down, and it paid. But first, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories like this one unless enough people click. One click. Come back. Because the next part of this story is the part nobody at the nozzle saw coming. Here is the question almost nobody asked at first. Where does the mountain go? When you wash down a hillside, all that gravel and clay and mud, the part with no gold in it, which is almost all of it, has to go somewhere. And it went into the rivers. The miners called the waste slickens, this fine slurry of mud and ground rock and mercury. It poured out of the sluices and into the creeks, and the creeks carried it into the rivers, the Yuba, the Feather, the Bear, the American, and the rivers carried it down out of the mountains and into the flat farming country of the Central Valley. Year after year, billions of cubic yards of it. The estimates of the total debris run to well over 1 billion cubic yards of material flushed into the Sacramento River system. It is one of the largest deliberate movements of earth ever accomplished by people, and it was done one hillside at a time, by water. And down in the valley, the rivers could not carry it all. The mud settled. The riverbeds rose. They rose so high in places that the rivers no longer ran in their channels at all. They ran above the level of the surrounding farmland, held in only by mud banks. The Yuba River, choked with mining debris, spread out into a flow described as 2 miles wide and 20 feet deep in flood. It buried orchards. It buried pastures. It buried whole farms under feet of gray, sterile muck where nothing would grow. And then the floods came. After a bad flood in the 1870s, the town of Marysville, down where the Yuba meets the Feather, was buried in as much as 25 feet of mining muck. The streets, the foundations, the fields around it. People built their levees higher. The riverbed rose higher still because the mud kept coming. The bed of the Feather River was lifted so much that it flooded Sacramento again and again, and the river was left so shallow and choked that boats could barely use it for decades after. The farmers were drowning, slowly, in a mountain that men 100 miles upstream were washing down for gold. So the farmers organized, and this is where the story turns from engineering into history of a different kind. The farmers and townspeople of the valley formed the Anti-Debris Association in Marysville and the surrounding country, banding together against the mining companies whose slickens were burying them. It was, in a real sense, one of the first organized environmental fights in American history. Ordinary farmers against powerful, profitable industrial companies over the right to not have their land destroyed by someone else's waste. And it went to court. One quick note. I turned the full story of California's hydraulic gold mining into a book, everything the records gave me, all the names and all the numbers. If you want it, the link is in the description. Because what happened in that courtroom changed more than one industry. The case carries the name Woodruff against the North Bloomfield Gravel Mining Company. Edwards Woodruff was a landowner, and the North Bloomfield Company ran the largest hydraulic operation in the state, the one that carved the Great Canyon, the diggings near Nevada City known as Malakoff. The farmers brought their suit in the early 1880s, and the judge assigned to it was a man named Lorenzo Sawyer, a federal circuit judge, and here is a detail I love. Sawyer himself had come to California in the gold rush. He had been a miner. He knew exactly what these men were doing and why, and he was not hostile to mining as such. This was not an outsider who hated the industry. This was a man who had panned for gold himself, sitting in judgment on what gold mining had become. Sawyer took it seriously. He took it slowly. The case ran for about 2 years, and when he finally handed down his decision, on the 7th of January, 1884, the written opinion ran to more than 200 pages, and his conclusion was clear. The mining companies, he ruled, could not go on dumping their debris into the rivers, because in doing so, they were destroying the property of others, the farms, the towns, the navigable rivers, the public infrastructure paid for by the citizens of the state. A company's right to mine its own land did not include the right to bury its neighbors. He issued an injunction against the dumping of mining debris into the river system. It sounds narrow, and in legal terms it was, but the effect was enormous, because hydraulic mining only worked if you could wash the waste away for free. The whole method, the giants, the flumes, the reservoirs, the sluices, all of it depended on the rivers carrying off the slickens at no cost. Once you had to contain your own debris, to build dams and pits to hold billions of cubic yards of mud, the economics collapsed. The Sawyer decision did not technically outlaw hydraulic mining. It just took away the free dumping ground. And without the free dumping ground, the great mines could not pay. The monitors fell silent. The largest era of hydraulic mining in California was over, ended not by a lack of gold, but by a courtroom. Historians often call the Sawyer decision one of the first major environmental rulings in American law, a moment when a court said that an industry's profit did not outweigh the public's right to its land and its rivers. It was decided by a former gold miner against the gold mines. And now, what remains? This is the part where I always go quiet. Because you can still go and stand in it. The Great Canyon at Malakoff did not heal. The land does not grow back the way you would hope. More than 140 years after the water stopped, the diggings are still there. A man-made gorge, nearly a mile and a half long and hundreds of feet deep, the bare gravel walls still streaked orange and white and rust, still mostly raw, the pines only slowly creeping back at the edges. It is preserved now as Malakoff Diggins State Historic Park, a few thousand acres set aside in the 1960s, up in the hills above Nevada City. People drive out to look at it the way they look at a natural wonder, except it is not natural. It is a wound that became a monument, and the engineering is still readable in the ground if you know what to look for. You can walk into the Hiller Tunnel, a passage more than 500 feet long, cut through the rock so the water in the slurry could drain away from the pit. The great bedrock drainage tunnel I described earlier, the one nearly 8,000 feet long, is still there too, the dark mouth of it opening on the far side of the ridge, the same passage that the company spent years boring so the giants could run at full pace. You can still find the lines of the old ditches contouring along the ridges, the cuts where the flumes ran, the scars of a private river system built to take a mountain apart. And it is worth saying that Malakoff was the largest of these, but it was not the only one. All across the gold country, from the Yuba to the American, there were dozens of hydraulic operations, large and small, each with its own ditches and giants and sluices, each washing its own hillside into the rivers. Malakoff was simply the giant among giants, the one that grew so big it carved a canyon you can see from the air, and the one whose company name ended up on the lawsuit that stopped them all. Near the diggings, the little town of North Bloomfield still stands, much of it preserved. At its peak, it held something like 2,000 people. A full town with a general store and a drugstore and a church and a school, all of it serving the great mine. Some of those buildings, a few of them dating back to the 1850s, are still standing, kept as they were. The wooden storefronts, the church, the schoolhouse. You can walk the one main street of a town that existed for the sole purpose of washing down the hills, and is now quiet, the giants gone, the water turned off, the gold long since carried away. And the rivers still carry the story too, in a sadder way. The mercury the miners poured into their sluices is still down there in the sediment of the Yuba and the Feather, and the wetlands of the valley, and biologists still measure it, still warn about the fish. The beds of those rivers were raised so high by the slickens that the work of managing them, the levees and the channels, went on for generations and goes on still. A flood that began in a wooden trough in the 1870s is, in a sense, still being held back today. I keep coming back to the men at the nozzles. We have the name of Edward Madison, who first carved a wooden tip onto a hose and aimed water at a bank. We have the name of Lorenzo Sawyer, the old miner turned judge, who finally said, "Enough." We have the company names, but the men who actually stood there, day after day, in the roar and the spray, holding the giants, hauling the boulders out of the sluices with iron forks, building 45 miles of flume across the canyons one board at a time, those men are mostly nameless to us now. The records kept the gold totals and the cubic feet and the dimensions of the canyon. They did not keep the names of the man who fell, or the man who laid the last plank of the high flume, or the man who ran the little giant in the rain. I wish they had. That absence is, to me, the truest thing in the whole story. We remember the canyon. We forget the hands. They aimed water at a mountain until the mountain was gone. They built a river to do it. They washed 11 million ounces of gold out of the hills, and they buried a valley in mud doing it. And in the end, a courtroom told them to stop. And they stopped. And the silence came back to the diggings and never quite left. Go and stand at the edge of that orange canyon someday. Listen to how quiet it is. Then imagine the sound of 7 giants running day and night, and the whole hillside coming down like a brown river, and try to hold both of those things in your mind at once. That is what these men did. That is what it cost. And the country is still living with the shape they left in the land. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shout-out in upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from Boss Tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.